Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb. Today, I'm joined by Doctors Rod Rosenblatt, Scott Keith, and Adam Francisco. We just got back from Norway last week. If you haven't listened to the 2 episodes that we recorded there, I highly suggest it. The one was a panel-style live recording, semi-similar to what we do at the Here We Still Stand conference. It's different than a normal show because we have generally more people on the show when we do those panels, and also when we're in front of a live audience at a conference. Usually when we record, we sit originally in the old days, we sat around a round table. Now we sit at a square table, sort of facing each other. And at a panel, in order to see the audience, you're all facing one direction. So the usual sort of conversations that we have are just logistically more difficult. It really is more difficult to just have sort of a hands-on conversation when you're not facing each other. So, but it was still a great episode. And then the second episode was in the normal style of the Thinking Fellows, but also a little bit of a callback to the past, because we sat in a bar and did it, and everybody had a drink, and it was a lot of fun. It was nice having the mobile rig out, and we had some guests on the show. We passed headsets around. It was a good time, a little more informal than it's been in recent months and years. And I had a good time, and we're back now, and we're going to do a normal episode. It is going to be a little bit Thinking Fellows old school, though, because we busted out the pipes and some whiskey today, and Adam has a cheap cigar, and a fancy...
I mean, it was $3.
It was $3, to be fair, yeah.
Right?
4.
And Rod has his tried and true coffee mug, so I think classic Thinking Fellows episode today. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to do an episode on, and Adam came up with this. He emailed me or texted me like at 2 a.m. in the morning sometime a couple weeks ago.
I don't stay up that late.
Yeah.
I slacked you, I think.
Oh, he slacked me, yeah. And he said, hey, why don't we do an episode on how have you benefited from philosophy? And I thought that was a great idea, just something we could actually have a conversation
Was
about.
he just asking you that question at 2 a.m., or was he suggesting it for a topic?
I hope he was suggesting it for a show topic.
I think I was having a dark night of the soul. And it just, no.
It was a random text. It was
yeah.
out of nowhere. It was out of nowhere.
No, I thought we've talked about faith and reason in the past and epistemology. I thought,
Sure.
as far as in these podcast conversations go, when we ask a question at the beginning that's kind of open-ended, they tend to be a lot more fluid, I think is the term, and organic, and even better term now, authentic.
Wow.
Authentique. So I thought it was a great question. And then when I brought it up to my dad, he said, well, I think this is going to be a good one with Rod, because the only reason I ever studied or bothered to read any philosophy was because Rod pushed me to. So I think...
I remember the first day in a philosophy class with Dr. Rosenblatt, you said something like you had studied or started your PhD in philosophy, and you thanked God every day for that you didn't finish it.
Yep. Well, the thing was, what I didn't know, I was at USC and accepted into the doctoral program in philosophy. My advisor was Dallas Willard, and I was teaching a 2/3 load in Santa Barbara at Westmont and commuting to Watts.
Ugh.
Think that, commuting to Watts. So it's, the travel demands were just crazy.
Yeah.
I was doing it, and then at a certain point, blessed Dallas Willard called me aside, and we had some conversation, and I was discouraged enough by what he was saying to say, one could go to Europe, and he jumped on it. One could. What I didn't know was that they were having within the department war. That always bodes badly for grad students when the faculty itself is at war. They fight in indirect ways that are just awful. So I jumped out, gave all that money to USC for my medical school. I had to kiss it off and applied to Strasbourg. So I still believe, and I think there's every reason to believe, that even if somebody's going into a theological field, maybe deeply, you really need at least an intro to Phil for almost all fields. Why is that? I'm gonna answer that as Caleb asks questions, but I'm on the side of no. An intro to Phil will do you a whole lot of good in a whole lot of ways you might not be aware of. A textbook that has a whole chapter on ways of knowing, for instance, depending upon how the author arranged the material, I always tended to the books that were not from Socrates to Sacht, but the ones that were subdiscipline by subdiscipline by subdiscipline by subdiscipline. But regardless, I'm going to probably advocate, if it's just one semester course in Intro to Phil, don't even think twice. Take it.
Yeah, at Concordia, it's still required, right? In the core program, at least one course in philosophy.
Yeah.
And I think it has been.
Well, that's the natural one. If it's one course, take Intro.
Yeah.
And that's I mean, at least in my experience, having taken it there, it was a good little course because it tries to get you to ancient sources.
Yep.
Instead of just reading philosophy about philosophy.
Yep.
As an introduction, it's got a nice reader to it. You can actually say, hey, I've read some Plato, I've read some Aristotle, I've read some Cicero, and moved your way up through, like the Middle Ages, doing some Aquinas, things like that. I thought it was great. And then there were also plenty of opportunities after that to then take, you taught for a long time. I think I was in your very last version of this class, analytic philosophy.
Yes.
I took a philosophy class with Bachman, with Dr. Bachman. I don't remember.
Ethics, probably.
Yeah, I think
Philosophical ethics.
philosophical ethics and Christians and ethics. It was like two ethics courses with him.
Yeah, I was so glad he was there because I don't have an interest in that subfield.
In ethics?
Yeah. What was nice to have two guys or more colleagues to whom I could send students who really enjoyed that sub-discipline, really liked it, thought it was terribly important.
And it was similar to the core in that he sort of just gave readings in primary source texts or out of, and then some of it was like ethical cases. Like he had done some medical ethics out of journals and stuff, which were interesting too. But after that course, you had also then read thoroughly in some Kant and things like that. Which,
Mill.
Yep. And you feel like even if you're not one for Kantian ethics, it's important to read that before you sort of make those assertions.
At USC, my doctoral course in ethics was taught by John Hospers, the first founder of the Libertarian Party in the States, and terrific course. The only downside to it was there were about 6 exams during the semester, and he would pass out to us the pool of questions from which he would draw. Well, the first one, I decided to type out what my answers would be and work on them as prep for the test. It was 52 single-space type pages.
Oh, my.
That was for just one of 6. So pedagogically, it left something to be desired. But he knew his stuff.
That's the thing with philosophy, though. It just goes on
and on.
Yeah.
The question isn't always where do you start reading, it's where do you stop.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And bless anybody who writes a simple, straightforward intro to Phil.
In simple, straightforward English sentences.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, because that's a
Yes.
problem. Because there's so much to read, you feel like if you get into a conversation, sometimes it's just like a contest to see who can use a word that the other one doesn't understand.
gosh.
Right?
Heck.
Or reference somebody that the other person hasn't read and make them either admit it or act like they did. And I found that a lot if you start.
Yeah, stay out of those circles. And it's another place where you think Oxford University Press, and their very short intros.
Yeah, I think those are very helpful.
They're not even a quarter-inch thick, or they're close to it. And they get good writers for those, and the thing is a quarter-inch thick.
I always I like those a lot, and I've used them. But I always warn people that don't think that just because it looks small, which it is, so it's booklet size, usually not very thick, that it's easy reading, because it's often not. I mean, it's understandable, but they're doing something that's often harder than the other thing. They're trying to explain very complex times in history or historical figures and or movements, theological or philosophical or political, in very short, straightforward terms, which is not simple.
Yep.
And so if you see this booklet, you could think, well, this is going to be simple. It's not simple. It's compact.
Yep.
That's not the same thing.
Yep.
I think the Introduction to Philosophy was the first one I ever got, and it was a gift from you when you came back the first time from Oxford, when I was, I'm probably a junior in high school or something like that. I don't remember the exact years, but yeah, that was the first one I ever got. It's blue. I have that one on my shelf.
Yeah. You very quickly see how C.S. Lewis contrasts with others.
Yeah.
And the basic thing I think of is Lewis was constitutionally incapable of writing 3 pages without going to the concrete. You always find in Lewis, think of it this way, or do you remember when you... He didn't like staying out of the concrete. He wanted into the concrete to help to do this in a short fashion. So he would and other writers don't go to the concrete like that. Lewis did.
Yeah, pointing to some, in a sense, denotative, pointing to something that, that you know,
Yeah.
to drive home the example.
Yeah. And he was a genius at it. Just a genius. Another name that occurs to me is the son of his father, Nagel. The name is Nagel or Nagel. We had a massive intro to Phil book at USC on that, on the intro. And the son does some of the short work. I think he's some sort of believing Christian, but I'm not sure. The son, certainly not the father. But
and we're not talking about Nagel, Norman Nagel.
No,
for our listeners.
Yeah,
no,
Talking
it's
about
the
philosopher
same,
Nagel.
No, different guy. But that's a name worth sort of saying. Well, if I run into it, maybe I'll open
I think
the
it's
cover.
Thomas Nagel.
I think that's it, Thomas. Anyway, sorry.
No, you're fine.
Well, you know, and historically speaking, Christians have always read
Studied
philosophy.
yeah.
Yes, except for our church.
Well, I'd say maybe
I'm
even
thinking way
except for
before our
modern
church.
time,
Yeah.
except for modern times, perhaps even.
Okay.
I mean, I don't
Broader
think,
evangelicalism, I would group in with that.
I don't think they're spending a lot of time in philosophy.
They sure were when I was Campus Crusade for their Summer Institute at Colorado State, and Moreland was teaching them. I mean,
Maybe they are.
You guys are going back to the 20th century. I'm thinking 5th century.
yeah.
All right, historian, go
St.
ahead.
Augustine, and
Okay,
who
sure.
could say something, and Luther can almost quote him verbatim. Plato is a friend to Christianity. He gets as close as any other philosopher got to Christianity, but he's still they didn't use the term light years, but still far away. But you know, there's a lot of early church through the Middle Ages up until about the 13th century using Plato
Absolutely.
in some way, shape, or form to organize Christian theology.
Yep.
And then Aristotle takes over, and at least the method informs Christian theology. Could we say that systematic theology is still very influenced by Aristotelian methodology?
Absolutely. If you just think
It's a 1-to-1.
just think taxonomy. The tree of knowledge, it splits animal from plant and then splits more from there. We use Aristotle in the naming or the taxonomy or the structure all the time. That doesn't mean you're accepting anything about Aristotle's philosophy, but it's acknowledging he sure knows how to organize material so I can find it.
Yeah.
Well, and theology and philosophy are like linked. It's so explicitly. So many theology says so many things about philosophy, or even philosophical inquiry, questions about meaning, question about
Absolutely.
where do you get knowledge,
Yep.
ethical questions.
Yep.
So they're always butting into each other, or at least running parallel.
Yep. And that's worth knowing just from the beginning. Just that. And I totally understand how a Westerner of today would say, why should I bother with a course in philosophy?
You know, see, that's interesting to me because it's when you, and Adam does too. And I taught some of the basic courses at the university, and Adam still does at the core history class. And that question comes up with students, and they'll even ask that question about history, and they'll ask it certainly about the theology courses that I taught, and I assume they ask it about the philosophy courses. And it's interesting to me, and the answer that I would always give, both in theology too, even if they weren't a Christian, and philosophy, is that courses like this teach you more than the subject matter.
Yes.
So when you're studying Plato, you're learning about more than just Plato. You're learning how Plato thought, and then how his thought influenced the idea of thought for thousands of years after that.
Right.
And how you might still, the way you think about things, might sort of get, you can see remnants of this Platonic thought in the way you think about X, Y, or Z, or
Yep.
Aristotelian thought in X, Y, or Z.
Yep.
And you take these courses to learn how to think more than just to learn, like in a history class, dates that you maybe will never use again.
In general.
Right. Or in a theology class, like specific Lutheran views on baptism that you might not use again, but you learn how people came to these thoughts and
Yep.
why they were important.
Yep.
And even in terms of sort of organizing subject matter in the university, I mean, historically, it went from the most important, theology, because this is like your eternal, this is determining in a lot of ways what you think about what happens to you from not just in this life, but in the life of the world to come, and then philosophy, and then down, mathematics and that type of thing, that these are all ordered in terms of how does one think about how they interact in this life now and in the life of the world to come. It's not just the subject matter.
Right.
And with a lot of these subjects, I'd even include history in that, you're learning how to think. You're not just learning when you're learning history, you're learning what people did, how they thought, why they made the decisions that they did or didn't make, what those the implications those decisions had on their life and maybe our life now, hundreds, even thousands of years later.
Sure.
To be educated, you have to understand sort of like the benefits that come from that more than just see it in terms of learning dates or learning about Plato or when he lived. And that's why I hate, especially at the collegiate level, tests that just ask questions like, when did Plato live? And
Yes.
which is ridiculous.
Yes.
I
agree.
He could have lived 2 weeks ago and his thought would still be, as important to know because of how monumental it was as it is, without being more than a couple thousand years old.
One of the ones that I used to attempt to use, and maybe you did too, was Jim Sayers' Why Believe Anything at All?
Yeah, I use, even in my talks, I still use that in the epistemology of theology talk, just because I think he answers the question to that age group better than I could on my own. As far as, listen, we all believe something, and we believe that something for particular reasons, and it's probably going to fall into one of these 5 reasons.
Yeah.
And one of them is philosophical.
Yeah.
Like we all have sort of philosophical presuppositions, whether we know it or not.
Yeah.
There's some real utility to being able to speak in an educated way on any of this too. I mean, I think especially in an age which is so, and maybe all ages have been like this and it just feels like it, but so divided, especially right now, that you get so many people just speaking from anecdotes or how they feel about a subject that you can't really carry a conversation whether you agree with that person or you disagree with them. And so there's even just some level of conversation that is gone, not because this person hasn't read Plato, but because the person you're having this conversation with never learned how to learn. Right? And so
Absolutely. And I look at this generation, and that one frightens me to death. It does, because what it looks like to me, old as I am, is that yelling has displaced arguments.
Well, name calling has.
Yeah.
You know, but you could just go through the list of informal fallacies
Yeah.
and say that these have become accepted norms for modern communication and correspondence, and especially political discourse.
Yeah.
And we've thrown out everything else. I was going to say, when I used to teach that class, and even when I do it in the talks that I give, also, one of the things, I don't start out with it, but maybe a third the way through the first one, before I go through like empiricism and rationalism, I'll say, I think everybody leans towards one of these just sort of naturally.
Yep.
And if you understand that, it explains something about why we sometimes have a hard time communicating with one another.
Sure.
More so than any personality test will, because in a sense, this explains how you're sort of wired in some way to look at the world. Right?
Yeah.
You're wired to look at the world sort of from the evidence to conclusion, or from a conclusion to the evidence.
Yep.
And if you are married to somebody that's the other way, you got to know that that's difficult.
Yeah, right.
And
I remember being in my first year seminary class. I didn't know anything. And I soon discovered that there were two of us that had the background in the natural sciences out of 70. Two. So, of course, all my questions were different kinds of questions to the prof,
yeah,
because all of my time had been spent in the lab and in math. Physics, chemistry, bio, and math. These guys were all history or soc majors or psych or something. And boy, did that make a difference. Gee.
yeah. I mean, I would love it if people would just learn, like in take a basic logic class, and just, which is sort of thinking as a basic epistemology class in a lot of ways, is just how do we know, and how do we know what we know, and how do we figure things out, and how do we know that they're in line with sort of logical determiners, and like something like the law of non-contradiction.
How many courses teach that? It's almost always an intro to Phil.
But it would help so much in our modern conversations about anything.
Yes.
If somebody understood that if you cannot give a way that your idea can be falsified,
Right.
that it's a bad idea. If
Right.
it's simply impossible. I mean, think of the implications that would have for something like the conversation on, dare I say, man-made climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we falsify this idea?
Right. I just wrote that to
If you can't,
I have a new relative, elderly. I can say it. He was the professor of anesthesiology at Johns Hopkins Medical. He's now a father-in-law to me. He lost his faith when he was in college, and I returned to the Christian faith under a course by an atheist, vertebrate embryology, and I returned to theism. He was an atheist. He would have been horrified that was happening, but it was. So I recently wrote him and said, one of the things that we tend to ask people is, what factual state of affairs would have to prevail for you to surrender the position you now hold?
right.
Now, that can clear the decks. If the
Absolutely,
person says, there is no factual situation which would cause me to change
Yeah.
my position, I say, I appreciate, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to avoid getting political here, but I'm just back from Norway, so this climate change stuff is fresh on my mind. But at the same time, it's this. If you were applied to some of those logical standards that you might learn in an intro to Phil class or an intro to critical thinking class,
Yeah.
you can weed out a lot of the crap that
Yes.
comes your way before it really takes root in your sort of being and
Right.
becomes an expression of who you are and you own it. I think that all the time when you're listening to just people talk about anything and politicians, and what about the idea that I ought not hold two positions which are inherently contradictory to one another,
Right.
like that this is a bad thing,
Right. Right.
that I maybe should adjust my position.
Right.
I need to spend all my time saving future people in the world, but I think that the world's overpopulated. mean, that's
Right.
that's a difficult thing to hold at the same time. You know, I mean, maybe you can do it, but I'll stop because it's
Well,
currently the most political show we've ever done.
Yeah, yeah,
so I'm gonna stop.
you're getting political, but I mean, it's an example. Since the question originally was how has it benefited you, it's an example of an area where you could navigate more clearly, either side
Yeah.
of the aisle in the United States or wherever in the world, is that you could recognize when somebody's sort of spewing nonsense from your own party or from the opposition,
Or from the pulpit,
or from the
Yes. Yes.
or from the lectern in the classroom, or the podium in the classroom,
or a YouTube video, or
How do you know that your professor's not full of hooey if you don't have some tools in the toolbox to help you identify when something just isn't lining up?
Yeah. Yeah.
Philosophy helps with that. Critical thinking helps with that.
Yep.
Learning, I think I've said this before, one of the most foundational things that I learned as an undergrad were the idea of the difference between analytic, synthetic, and nonsensical statements.
Mm-hmm.
Because you come to realize how much of what people speak of as truth is just simply nonsensical. I mean, it's just not verifiable.
Yeah. Falsity would be progress.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's more, I just don't know what this is.
We've talked on the show, and it's a phrase that sometimes gets people uncomfortable because you can sort of say it the other way around too. But we said one of the unique things about Christianity is that it is falsifiable.
Yep.
You could say verifiable, but I actually kind of like that it makes people uncomfortable to use the sort of the vulnerability that comes from that position.
Christianity almost alone can be factually overthrown.
Yeah.
Ask somebody in the religious world, could your religion, the one you're holding to, be factually overthrown? What would it take? Could facts
That's
do it?
heresy. To imply such a thing in most religions is heresy.
Yep.
And I get nervous when people in Christianity start to treat it like heresy too when we ask that question. It drives me crazy. My daughter texted me this last night as an example of nonsensical statement.
Okay.
And with the caption, what does this even mean? So this is something that came through on her social media feed. May my present day intimacy with Jesus, presence, and his word always be bigger than my influence. And she says, what? What does that even mean?
Yeah, of course. Of course.
I'm not sure.
Of course.
I'm not sure that's true. I don't think it's false. I think it's
Gibberish.
It's just a statement.
Maybe you need some special gnosis to know what that means.
Yeah,
And it
But
definitely.
all of those things, everything we're saying here, the easiest intro to it is Intro to Phil or Critical Thinking. If it's one course in college, take it.
Yeah, I agree. I think critical thinking, we've done I think I've lost count on how many times we've done episodes on epistemology.
Sure.
And that gets to the point of here. I think one of the other ones is just the value of language and the weight of words plays into this too, especially for Christians, since our system of belief hangs on the word, and it's being passed down through documents. You have to know sort of the value of that, what words mean, translation, some sort of trust in the transmitting of knowledge through language, something which has been challenged in philosophy.
A whole lot.
Is sort of been accepted in many ways in the culture.
Yeah, but if you've taken some philosophy and you know that that's actually a philosophical position.
Yes.
And it can be identified, and it's not just a feeling that somebody has or that it's a new idea that somebody's positing. That this is something that's been around for a long time and has classically been held by a very small fraction of academics because they have a very difficult time applying that to anything outside the classroom.
Yep.
I mean, it's good to know such a thing.
It is, yeah. And I think one of the roadblocks.
Skeptics never live as skeptics.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
One of the roadblocks, you said take an intro to Phil class. And I think what I experienced with people who sort of checked out of those classes is, and you said it, there's some pedagogical problems, things like rote memorization of dates, or professors who have a hard time explaining the value outside of justifying their position at the university somehow. And that was one of the biggest questions I ran into among majors that were not within the classical liberal arts at the university, say business or something like that, was why should I have to take history, philosophy, theology? What does it have to do with?
Because we don't want you
business?
to be a dumb business person.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'd rather you be a smart business person or an educated business
Yeah.
person.
Well, and in good sales, something like sales has to do with the psychology of people, the way they think. Epistemology
Sure.
is a huge part. Why do people make buying decisions? Why do markets fluctuate? It's a philosophy. It's there's a global philosophy involved with this, and so to ask those questions seems sort of ridiculous to anybody who knows the answer.
Yeah, well,
but-
somebody who knows those answers would be a dangerous salesman, wouldn't they?
yeah. That's right.
Well, I'm always on the lookout for those people like the Oxford University Press books or something that's available on YouTube that covers one tiny subject really well and does it in 20 minutes or does it in 40 minutes flat. That's why I'm always looking at the catalog for the teaching company. I don't look at all of it, but I go to philosophy, history, theology, and so forth automatically to see if there's something there that can help people in a very finite amount of time to get an idea of what's going on here.
So we made it about 3/4 of the way through the show, and I can only imagine there are a handful of listeners going, well, on the last episode on the use of reason, you said reason is the devil's whore, and now you're sitting here across this table praising philosophy for 45 minutes. What's the big deal?
Have we ever said reason is the devil's whore?
Well, I think
don't
we've
think
said
so.
that
We've maybe
Luther
quoted Luther
Yeah.
saying reason's the devil's
He,
whore.
he had in mind Aristotle as being the substance of what theology studies. He was not saying that Aristotle wasn't of great value in arranging topics, taxonomy. He uses Aristotle all the time with regard to certain subjects, and then as soon as Aristotle says, I wrote the books that you should study for theology, Luther says, what in the world could he mean by that? Because at the time, in the medieval ages, much of what they were studying was Aristotle through Aquinas.
Yeah, I'd say that's an indictment of Aquinas for Luther more than it is of Aristotle.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
I've done some in the last couple of years. Done some reading on this. Specifically, gone through David. Why can't I think of his name? Dave.
Hume?
Utah guy. In the crew, David
Anderson?
David
Anderson.
Anderson's
Yeah,
book
Dave
on Luther's
Anderson.
epistemology.
Yeah.
And he makes a summarizing, and I don't want to speak out of turn for him, but he makes a great point in his book on Luther's epistemology that Luther is reacting to the imposition of whole philosophical systems onto biblical theology.
Yep.
He's not saying that we ought not use our God-given reason. He's not saying we ought not read the ancient philosophers and gain whatever wisdom we can from them.
Right.
But we don't take whole philosophical systems, i.e. Platonism, Aristotelianism, whatever, and impose them on biblical theology.
Yeah.
We instead read the Bible, use those tools that God gave you and that you've acquired through education to
Yep.
help you discern what the Bible is actually saying, and then communicate it to using those same tools that God gave you and that you've learned through your education. I mean, these guys were a believer in the idea of, moving from grammar to dialectic to rhetoric, learning.
Which they all tied to philosophers, essentially.
Well, yeah, I
as,
mean-
as maintaining that tradition.
In the grammar portion of that education, you're not just learning like A, B, C, D, commas, hyphens, whatnot. They're reading the authors.
Yeah.
And they're memorizing the authors. They're memorizing, including the philosophers. And,
Right.
in the dialectic, they're then learning to use the reasoning that they memorized, and then finally in the rhetoric, they're using their
How to communicate.
how to communicate that, how to speak about it.
How do you turn ideas into
Yeah, and it's-
transferred thought?
To say then that on that basis of this one statement, typically taken out of context, that Luther advocated for not studying philosophy is really kind of silly.
Well, it's so one example might be is that whole systems of philosophy could impose very easily on things like, say, sacraments, the means of grace.
Or an incarnation.
Or an incarnation. Materialism, for instance, would go at these things very aggressively. But in fact, to reject what that imposes over those, what the text says about
Well, the
Lord's
sacraments
Supper,
are
things like
a
that.
great. I mean, Luther specifically objected to the idea of saying, on the basis of philosophical principles, that God was not capable in the sacrament of being present in the supper.
Right.
And what
On the
people,
basis of philosophical, quote unquote, axioms, others were saying that this isn't a possible thing, so the scriptures might say something else. On the basis of his understanding of how to read and the perspicuity of scripture and how to identify the words and define the words and understand the words, he's saying the scriptures say that it is possible.
which is a philosophical position in itself, that's essentially arguing against the counter. It is a position within itself to say this is how the text ought to be read versus this
Yeah.
other alternative way to read the
Yep.
text.
And he fought vociferously for the simple reading of the text. It was in the original languages, but still, he was vociferous on the meaning you should first consider is the straightforward one, what they called the sensus naturalis.
I think an argument, we're a little off track here, an argument could be made that his whole career was one of fighting for the clarity of scripture.
Yeah, I think that could be defended.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All these arguments that he's in, all of these debates, he falls on with a rat. I mean, even early on with the early papists in the Roman Church, he falls on the side of the clarity of Scripture, up and against philosophical systems and or the authority of the Pope and or whatever.
Yeah.
In his fight with Erasmus, he falls on the clarity of Scripture. In his fight with those, in his mind that are attacking what the Scriptures say about the supper, he falls on the side of the clarity of Scripture.
Same thing with Anabaptists.
Yeah.
It's no wonder the statuary has him holding a big Bible at his chest or around him. That's not unfair, because it sort of illustrates in an aesthetic way what he was doing all the time. The simple text is the first one to consider. That is not literalism.
But they didn't first learn to read in Greek specifically just to read the Bible. They were reading the classics.
Yes.
They read everything.
Yeah. The Renaissance and the Reformation ran like two parallel railroad tracks. Same time, same area, coming to very, very different conclusions.
Yeah, I made a comment when we were in Norway that you could see this particularly in Melanchthon's catechetical works, was saying, and his were not towards students in the home like Luther's smaller catechism, but towards students of theology, saying, first, I can't do this. You need to stop reading this if you do not understand these Greek words. Like you have a basic form of learning grammar that you need to go do before we can even begin to catechize theologically. And that's something I think we've lost because catechesis in a way has been separated from the rest of education, and some sort of integrating that back into learning history, grammar, literature.
I try to illustrate it to people to say, I don't know if you know it. You may be a Lutheran and not know this. Luther's Small Catechism is one of the great books of the Western world.
Yeah, something everybody should read.
The Heidelberg Catechism is not.
That makes me giggle.
Calvin's Institutes is
Oh, yeah.
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 one of the great books of the Western world. But the catechisms, no. It's worth it, I think, to introduce the thought to people that maybe their favorite or their most hated book belongs in the category the great books or is part of the great conversation. That keeps the stained glass from keeping you from seeing. You step onto the university campus and there's no stained glass anywhere other than for an aesthetic display of something or other. But you're in the wide open field of the great conversation. And then to say, Luther's Catechism is one of those books.
Yeah, has something to say about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's good. Hey, we're about at the end. Anything else before we go, Adam? Did this?
Well, I was just going to say, in the Small Catechism, Luther's explanation of the first article of the Creed, he says, God has made me and all creatures, and He's given me my reason and my sense experience, and still preserves them.
Uh-huh.
So back to your question or your statement about Luther saying reason is the devil's whore. It's exactly what Dr. Rosenblatt was saying. That's what he's talking about when you use reason in a magisterial sense, or you impose a metaphysic on Christian theology. Other than that, Luther would say that reason, science, all this is essential
gift
for
to
the
you.
and I think
for the left-handed kingdom, the horizontal world, or however you want to put it.
And what he's getting at is just how easy it is to do that, is to impose that a system onto your theology. And he's experiencing it from all sides, and he thinks that's probably the essential. Getting back to this, sort of going to the scripture. This is
linchpin of it all.
Yeah, and this is it's sort of a natural inclination, probably because it is so essential in what you said, Adam, with the left-hand kingdom, to have systems, ways of doing things and thinking and communicating. So, well, we all good with this episode? I thought this turned out pretty good.
Yeah,
time went fast. I didn't feel like we were butting up against the clock. So
take an Intro to Phil course, or take an Intro to Critical Thinking course,
Or take both
or both.
and take notes.
Cool. All right, guys. Well, hey, thank you for listening to this episode. It was an enjoyable one for us. Like I said, sort of an old school Thinking Fellows episode with the pipes going on in the background. We could definitely use some more listener support towards our shows. I asked last month for some further listener support, saying, hey, I could really use, upwards of at least 10% of listeners of the Thinking Fellows donating to the show. Because one of the things that we try to do is make all of our podcasts and resources free. And that's not possible to do without listener support. And I don't want to, at any point, make the Thinking Fellows a paid-to-access program. This is a conversation we want as many people as possible to have access to. And so I thank those people who are already donors to the show, who have been supporting us for months or years. And I do want to encourage you that if you've been listening to the Thinking Fellows for a while, if you found this show a benefit and you've wanted to participate in these conversations, that you too consider donating. So it's 1517.org/donate. I'll put a link in the show notes. And again, any amount is worthwhile to us. So thanks for listening. Bye-bye.